Welcome back. I'm joined by John Carpay as we discuss the recent prorogation of the Canadian Parliament and what that means for Canada. And of course, the JCCF, the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, court action to see if it can be put on hold or reversed, I guess, in some cases. So let's talk about those arguments. So what are your arguments against why this prorogation is unconstitutional?
Well, under our Constitution, the government is supposed to be accountable to Parliament, and this is central. It's a hard-won right that people fought for over centuries to gradually reduce the power of the king and increase the power of the House of Commons. And so many centuries of turmoil and fighting, including violence and bloodshed. And so it's a very important part of our Constitution that Parliament is sovereign. Parliament is supreme over the government. The government is accountable to Parliament. And so the question we put before the court is, should the government be accountable to Parliament, or can Parliament be a tool of the government to serve the government's interests? That's the central question. And it's going to be great to get an answer from the court, because currently we have no case law on this. Nobody really knows what are the powers of the Prime Minister to prorogue Parliament. There's just no Canadian case law on it. We have a strong precedent from the United Kingdom, which the court can follow if it chooses to, but it's not bound by that precedent. So it's going to be worthwhile.
And what is that UK precedent?
Well, in 2019, the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson prorogued Parliament for 5 weeks, which in Britain was a very long time because usually Parliament was only prorogued for a week or 2 or 3. And the court ruled that was unlawful because he was doing it to promote the partisan interests of the government, and it was not in the national interest. He was bypassing Parliament. He was ignoring the sovereignty of Parliament, and he used prorogation as a political tool to advance his government's interests in getting the United Kingdom out of the European Union in a certain way at a certain time. And so that's precedent that we think is similar in Canada, where an 11-week prorogation, much longer than usual, is there it's to serve the interests of one political party. It's not in the national interest.
Yeah, in fact, it seems like it's in the national disinterest because there's no government activity, there's no legislative activity. And of course, right, within days, you couldn't have planned this better, within days of this announcement of prorogation, now we have Donald Trump making good on his threat of tariffs.
This is not a good time for the ministers to not be accountable to Parliament. Now, on a practical level, if a Liberal leader is chosen on March the 9th, and if he or she calls for an election immediately, the prorogation case will perhaps not have made a huge difference on the ground politically, but it's still very important that we place some limits on the power of the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister in Canada is incredibly powerful, and it would be good to get some case law on the books that says that no, there are limits. The Prime Minister is not above Parliament, cannot use Parliament as a tool to advance the political interests of his or her political party. So, even if we have an election at the same time that we would have had an election anyways, it's still worthwhile to get a good constitutional law ruling.
No, I totally agree. These things happen and Canadians gasp, and we're waiting for some kind of, I think many Canadians are just wanting some idea as to whether this was allowed, or are we allowed to politically weaponize Parliament? And with that, what stood out to me because I studied political science in university is, why did the Governor General allow this to happen? The Governor General is the King's representative here in Canada, and ultimately they have to give their blessing on whether to proceed or not. Just because the Prime Minister asked for prorogation Parliament doesn't mean it had to have happened.
Well, that's a really interesting point. In the United Kingdom case, when the British citizens who opposed Boris Johnson's prorogation of Parliament, the way that they framed it and the way that the court ruled was that the Queen acted correctly by following the advice given to her by the prime minister. However, it was the prime minister's advice itself that was unlawful, and so they attacked it that way. So in Britain, there wasn't the issue there where they say, well, the Queen should have known better, and the Queen should have refused the prime minister's request. So you could make the argument in Canada that our Governor General should have refused the request of Prime Minister Trudeau. However, bear in mind, once you go down that road where the Governor General starts to exercise her own judgment and her own discretion about what's right or wrong, yes or no, the question is asked, do we really want a Governor General to exercise independent judgment and start making real decisions? Or do we want to stick with this, that she's a figurehead representative of the monarchy? So we're
You know what?
in
I
our
want to
court
tease
act.
this. I want to tease this issue a little bit more when we come back from this commercial break. We'll be right back.